Okay, my job is simply to welcome you to Glasgow University, to this Stevenson and Mackenzie lecture, and I'm going to just explain a little bit about the background to the Mackenzie part of the lecture, and then for the chairing of the lecture I'm going to hand over to John Curtis. The Stevenson origins, you've heard plenty of times, and I don't need to explain that, but the Bill Mackenzie Association is worthy of a few words of explanation. Bill Mackenzie was a professor at Glasgow University from 1966 to 1974, just 8 years. He was first the James Bryce Chair holder. That was the holder of the chair in political institutions, and secondly the Edward Caird chair, and that's a chair in theory. And the fact that Bill held both these posts is an indication of his range. He was both an empiricist and a theorist, and Bill's view was that to study politics you had to be both. He was a polymath. He knew every aspect of the subject, and he encouraged the teaching of every aspect of the subject. Prior to coming to Glasgow, well, he came to Glasgow essentially to retire when he was 59. Prior to that, he'd been in Manchester for the longest period of his appointment, for 18 years. And at Manchester, where there was a Mackenzie lecture, they'll tell you that everything that happened in Manchester is the leading research university because of Bill Mackenzie. And Bill's name in Manchester is one of great respect. So Bill had a huge reputation within the discipline as a whole. In fact, outside the LSE, Bill Mackenzie and Bernard Crick might be considered the two leading academics that were not towing the LSE line. I mentioned Bernard Crick partly because of his connection with the speaker we're going to speak of today, but Bernard Crick wrote me a reference in 1970 to get a job in Bill Mackenzie's department. Now, why did Crick want to get rid of me from Sheffield? Well, I won't go into that detail, but he did say that if you're under Bill, you'll have to have a pretty broad education, and actually Mackenzie will help you with your Greek translation, which he did. Bill was an expert on the whole range of politics. He was classically trained, but he was also a modern. He also thought that politics had to embrace the whole of the political sciences. And the most influential book of Bill's was one where he talks about politics as the key science and the promoting all other social sciences. He also thought that we ought to look at other sciences as well. He wrote about biological science and politics. So Bill was a great scholar himself, but most importantly, within the discipline, he encouraged a huge number of scholars. I have to say he was a tremendous supporter of the Stevenson Trust, because Stevenson took politics to the public and thought that, and involved teaching the public about politics. And Bill was a great supporter of this, though he wasn't a great public lecturer, I have to say. It was difficult for Bill's academic colleagues to follow all his lectures, let alone members of the public. But he was a great servant because no one would refuse Bill Mackenzie to come to Glasgow to talk about politics. Such was his reputation. In fact, Bernard Crick always regarded Bill Mackenzie as the icon. They were contemporaries. I mention that because in many ways, Bill and Bernard Crick both had the same vision, that the university shouldn't just be about an internal debate amongst academics and shouldn't just teach politics students, but they should also, it was your public duty. Part of your public obligation was to support public lectures, and Bill encouraged that. Today's speaker, I'm going to leave it essentially to John to introduce him, but I would like to point out that the references to Bernard Crick are in acknowledgement that our speaker today runs the Bernard Crick Centre at Sheffield University, and in many ways, I think, carries on the vision of Crick and Mackenzie to encourage a public understanding of politics. I notice also, amongst the many prizes that he's received, he includes both the Mackenzie Prize and the Crick Prize, awarded by Political Studies. Matt is chairman of the Political Studies Association at the moment. And he got these prizes before he became the chairman, I think.
Good, yes.
The Crick Prize is for politics teaching, and the Mackenzie Prize is for the greatest publication in the year on politics. So the connection with Crick and Mackenzie is continued in our speaker tonight. I'll ask John Curtis to say a few words about the speaker, to introduce the speaker. But it's my opportunity to introduce Sir John Curtis for the first time. Some of you will know. I just hand over. John.
Thank you very much indeed. If, like me, you spend many an evening doing the washing up, maybe the dishwasher is humming in the background, or maybe even the washing machine, and you've probably got Radio 4 in the background as kind of, with half an ear, and probably 9 evenings out of 10 you don't really take in what you've just heard. But I can certainly well remember one occasion when I listened to Radio 4 in the evening, and all of a sudden Matt came on, and he was giving a lecture as part of a series called In Defence of Politics. And it was one of those occasions when you did have to stop what you were doing and you had to listen to what was being said. He was, in truth, being very brave. Here he was, 7, 8 years ago, arguing in defence of politics, a title that he took from Bernard Crick and redefined and reevaluated for our time. But he was doing this within 12 months of the MP's expenses scandal, when, shall we say, politics and politicians were not necessarily the flavour of the month. And he made an impassioned plea that politics mattered, and it mattered not just to politicians or indeed even to political scientists, but also mattered to citizens. And of course it's the connection with citizenship and Matt's continued interest in citizenship and the connection between citizens and the state that makes him so appropriate as a speaker this evening. He does in truth walk in the footpaths originally laid down by Bernard Crick, and as Andrew has just explained, is exemplified by the fact he does now run the Bernard Crick Centre, which is essentially dealing with a whole variety of issues of public policy. One of them, perhaps in particular, might be of interest to you, is that Matt is currently a professorial fellow for the House of Commons. Now, you might want to ask, why is Matt a professorial fellow for the House of Commons? Well, if I've got it right, Matt, it's because it's one of your now weighty responsibilities is to make sure that the Palace of Westminster doesn't collapse before MPs have the courage to get out. Now, I think I saw about a week ago MPs finally screwed up the courage to vote to get out, but not until about 2022, and I think your fellowship runs out later this year, so maybe it's going to be in need of renewal. Anyway, I hope I said enough to make you realise that we are looking forward to an extremely interesting lecture given by an extremely talented speaker. So Matthew, can I give you the floor?
Thank you. Okay, thank you. The one word I'm going to sort of hinge upon there is this notion of bravery. So I'm going to do something I'm always tempted to say that politicians don't do, but I'm going to be very honest from the start. That actually, the lecture I'm going to give you is not the one I'd originally intended, and I'll tell you why. Because I was travelling with my wife at the weekend on Sunday, and she said, you're going up to Glasgow, what are you talking about? And I'm currently the Special Advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on Citizenship. And so I'd intended to use some of the material from that inquiry, but my wife said, well, you don't seem very excited by that. And she said, what's wrong? And I said, well, to be honest, citizenship is interesting, but the inquiry is fairly formal and technical and descriptive, and I don't know, it just doesn't fire me up. And so my wife said, well, if you were going to go to Glasgow and give a lecture on something that you really believed in, that you really thought mattered, something that really was different and exciting, what would it be about? Quick as a flash, I said, I know what it would be about. It would be about emotion and feelings and passion in politics, and why emotion, passion, and feelings matter. And she said, well, talk about that then. I said, well, hold on, I don't do emotions. Well, I do emotions, but they're not my area of academic research. But anyway, I've done it. And this lecture will be almost as new to you as it will be for me, because the last 3 days I've hardly slept writing about emotions and politics, and particularly, and this is sort of my hook for this evening, is why feelings trump facts. Does that sound okay? Oh, good. It'd be in trouble if you just said no. Right, so, but because I'm leaving my sort of normal safety net, you're going to tell how comfortable academically I am by how far I go from the lectern, okay? Because if I'm happy and I'm working on stable ground for me, I will move from the lectern. If I'm talking about stuff I'm not that confident about, I'll stay very close here. So physically, you'll be able to see exactly what's going on. So let's start. So good evening, and thank you everybody for coming on what isn't, from Glasgow standards, too bad an evening. And I'm really pleased to be invited to give the Mackenzie lecture. And thank you to everyone associated with the Stevenson Trust. I do just want to start, as currently the president of the Political Studies Association, by offering, I'm just so happy that John Curtis has had his decades of extraordinary service to the discipline recognised, and it is brilliant that we can now say, Sir John, and well done for everything. But let me begin by scaring you. You know who this is now. Who knows who this is? This is Bernard. This is Bernard Crick. I never met Bernard Crick, but as has already been said, he was a very close associate of the University of Glasgow and of the Stevenson Trust, and it really is a great honour to be here. But we're not here to talk about Bernard. We're here to talk about Bill. Now, to be quite honest, and I'm going to be honest this evening, it's almost slightly worrying looking back at the sort of calibre of some of the previous speakers that you've had for this lecture. And I'm slightly nervous that I might not be quite up to the task. Bill himself came from a reasonably prosperous family from Dundee. He was a precocious student. He passed his higher education exams to get into university at 14. He was held over to train and got into Oxford at 16 to do classics at Balliol. While he was there, he took a double first and almost every prize Oxford had to offer. I, by contrast, at the age of 15, left school with 1 GCSE and ended up in the army. Our paths have taken a very different route. And this experience has left me, to some extent, with a feeling of vulnerability. And vulnerability is actually something I want to talk about tonight. Vulnerability, feelings and emotions. But when I'm faced with august occasions such as this, I sometimes think of myself as I'm really not quite up to it, and that at any minute, the imposter here is going to be caught out, discovered, ridiculed, and sent back to whence I came, to Swindon, which is not a good place to be sent back from, if any of you have been to Swindon. But I've come to the conclusion that there's actually nothing wrong, actually, with admitting one's vulnerability, one's fears, one's feelings, no matter how irrational they might seem. So this evening, what I want to do is I want to hit a big red button, which I don't think many professors usually do, which is admitting to a certain vulnerability about not just politics, but about the academic study of politics itself. So it seems really fitting that I'm going to focus today on feelings and why feelings matter and why feelings, I think, so often trump facts. Because the more I look around the world and the more challenges we seem to face, the more that I think that students of politics, professors included, and practitioners of politics really need to understand why feelings matter and to engage at an emotional level. Simply put, I think it's an emotional disconnection that is at the root of the current populist signal. So this evening, I want to focus on 6 different things in 3 sections. I want to focus on imagination and anchorage. I want to focus on hope and sacrifice, then I want to focus on a bus and a tree. Now, as I've already said, this wasn't quite the focus that I'd originally intended. I was planning to talk, and to some extent still will talk, about the citizenship journey. But in considering how to approach that topic, I was struck by this strong sense that I was scratching at the surface of something that was actually far deeper and more profound. In many ways, what might be termed the citizenship challenge or the democratic challenge, which revolves around increasing evidence of public disaffection with politics on the one hand, and evidence of increasing social isolation on the other. I mean, it's amazing. This year, one of the first things that happened was the Prime Minister appointed a new minister. For what? This is the audience. I'll nod. When I want audience party, I'll nod. For loneliness, yes, to counter the epidemic of loneliness. With this high-profile announcement in mind, it's very interesting that 2017 ended with the government publishing a new democratic engagement strategy. The fact that it was published just days before the Christmas holiday almost guaranteed that it received absolutely no coverage or commentary. Anybody here seen it? I wouldn't bother. For those of you who still haven't booked your summer holidays, you might want to know that the 2nd to the 16th of July 2018 has been designated National Democracy Week, and I'm sure you won't want to miss it. So, of course, what's also really important when we think about citizenship, emotions, feeling, passion and politics, is the big thing we're waiting for, is the long-awaited integration strategy, the Casey Review. It was published back towards the end of 2016, and we still don't have a reply from the government. But what was fascinating and what was interesting was that Louise Casey, what she uncovered was a divided society in which black boys were still not getting jobs, white working class kids were, if anything, falling backwards in the education system. Muslim girls were often excelling at school and then facing incredibly poor job prospects. There were high levels of social and economic isolation in some places, and cultural and religious practices in others that were holding people back, particularly women. And overall, what the Casey report identified was the fraying fabric of our nation. But what's, I'd argue, more interesting about the document is that there was something deeper going on, and it was suggested almost between the lines of every sentence, the pages, and it was an emotional element. What the Casey report provided was a statement about the contemporary emotional dynamics and why feelings mattered. What Casey uncovered was that established populations in poor areas felt a sense of unfairness, anger, frustration about how local decisions were taken over issues such as housing, school places. Immigrant populations felt that their presence in these communities was resented. British Muslims felt particularly under siege and suspicion. But what was particularly important about the Casey report was its critique of the existing academic research. What the report concluded was that too much research had been conducted that either sought to highlight positive trends or which focused on the more specific, quantifiable issues, and which led to a focus on distant survey-style research. But very little research seemed to capture what Louise Casey called the mood of communities. The mood of communities. And that's what I want to get to tonight. How do we actually understand the mood of communities, the multiple publics that are out there? And this is a quote: "Too often the data seems to be conducted at a level that is so high or general that no meaningful conclusions can be made or policy decisions reached. This risks creating further disengagement, and it may increase perceptions that their views, the public's views and opinions, are being ignored and difficult issues swept under the carpet." Well, now we know that difficult issues were swept under the carpet. But this point has haunted me. It's come back to me because there's something about my own research and my own vulnerability as an academic that I couldn't help but thinking that my own methodological approach, that was generally institutionally focused and facts-based, was missing something. Where was my grasp of the emotional content of politics? To what extent was a focus on institutional reform, democratic innovations and public policy, my normal world, seeking to respond to the symptoms but not going to the root of these major challenges? As a social scientist, I've been trained to operate with a currency of facts. But what happens if feelings trump facts? And this is something that's preoccupied me even more and more and more. Through the UKIP surge in 2014 and 2015, it gripped me as I watched the rise of nationalist populism across Western Europe. I couldn't help think about it as Brexit emerged like an unexpected beast on the horizon. And then, of course, this. And to some extent, a worry about an emotional disconnection hit me with Corbyn mania, something we might come back to. So my concern was not just that the emotional basis of politics seemed to be changing. Politics has always had an emotional basis. I'm getting emotional. See, I've started to wave my arms around. Gosh. It's just that the nature and the intensity and the basic incompatibility of emotions seem to be increasing. There was a clash. Maybe that's why we hate politics, to use the title of Colin Hayes' book. Maybe that's due to an existence of an emotional disconnection that demands a very different political response. If the growing gap between the governors and the governed that surveys do reveal is to be closed. Indeed, could it be that actually the populist parties were proving far more adept at forging that emotional connection and therefore funneling frustration into the ballot box? At the same time, my sense was that the social and political sciences had very little to offer in measuring, gauging, understanding why feelings matter. So, I want to just spend this lecture talking about three things: citizenship, anti-political sentiment, and emotions. And in a way, I want to stir them up. I want to stir them up so that we understand why feelings matter, and sometimes, not all the time, why feelings trump facts, and what are the implications of that, both for academics and for politicians and for the public. But when it comes to understanding these debates, as I've already said, I've been worried about this going back at least to 2014, but I've always put off writing and talking about it because examining emotions is methodologically difficult and politically risky. And then came a big kick in November 2016, and it was a big kick to me that came in a very unlikely source. Who's this? Very interesting. I thought you'd have got this one. Okay, same person, different photo. Who's this? Who kicked me and forced me to scratch this emotional itch about my role as an academic? Was Grayson Perry. The award-winning, Turner Prize-winning, Reith-lecturing Grayson. I met him through work with the BBC, and he received an award from the Political Studies Association. And he was very naughty. Say, look, I'm feeling a bit more confident now. I'm going to go over here. And then when I get scared, I'm near Sir John. Do I have to bow? I always feel when I meet vice-chancellors or members of the House of Lords, I always have an instinctive, it's my army training. So, where was I? Grayson. So, Grayson came along and came to the Political Studies Association, and he accepted his prize, and then he was very naughty in a good way, because he said this, and I know we should never fill PowerPoints with text, this is the only one, but I want to get it right. He stood up in front of hundreds of the world's leading social scientists in the wake of the Brexit decision, and Grayson said this: I'm so honoured to be given this award by a room full of experts. I'm not an expert, I'm an artist, and I always feel like the academics are hovering behind me when I pontificate on anything. Like they're going to catch me out. But I think the word truth is really interesting. As we often talk about truth in terms of academic truth, statistical truth, empirical truth, scientific truth, but very little do we actually talk about emotional truth. And I think that the one thing that all the experts need to improve is their emotional literacy. Because what the liberal academic elite, of which I am not part, because I'm from Swindon, rules me straight out, what the academic liberal elite has done is let us down. Because they are not emotionally literate enough to understand what 52% of the electorate was thinking or feeling. There is a whole world out there that we need to have more empathy with, even if we don't like the results of what those kinds of feelings bring about. And then he paused. He looked around and he said, "But I thank you for this award from the experts," and walked off. And that really hit me in a positive way, because it made me think about the relationship between feelings and behaviour and empathy, and why feelings matter, and why feelings might prove resistant to rational research-based arguments. The argument that Grayson was making with his typical flair and precision was that feelings matter more than many experts, academics included, seem to understand. Feelings remain real to the individual, irrespective of how many times they're told that the evidence is to the contrary. And yet, it is possible to suggest that political science in general, and the analysis of political disaffection and anti-political sentiment in particular, has, with only a few notable exceptions, generally failed to acknowledge why feelings matter, let alone explore how certain positive emotional feelings might be cultivated. So this evening I want to do three things in three parts for three reasons. I want to respond and explore this argument about a lack of emotional literacy within the liberal academic elite. And I want to do this through a focus on the imagination and on anchorage. And broadly, my argument is that too many academics have lost this, and the public crave this. In this regard, with this in mind, I want then to move on to explore the seam of scholarship that has looked at emotions, and to understand what that can tell us about why feelings may well trump facts. And I'll do this by focusing on two more concepts: concept of hope and on sacrifice. And then I'll finish, if we have time, with a very quick look at a bus. Anybody recognise this bus? Who said that? No, it's not, Sir John, but it's close. It's not Sheffield. And a tree, but I don't know if we'll get to the bus and the tree, so we'll just see how it goes. So to recap, it's going to be imagination, anchorage. It's going to be hope and sacrifice, bus and tree. But now I've made this decision to shift from the citizenship journey, why have I decided to do it? Well, I've decided to do it because, in a way, I wanted to stay loyal to Bill Mackenzie. William James Miller Mackenzie, Bill Mackenzie to his friends and colleagues. I never met Bill. I wish I'd been able to. Bill liked puzzles. And it's really important to understand what sort of academic Bill was, because it relates to this notion of imagination and breadth, which I think is really important. He understood that politics, like life, was rarely tidy, and as a result was best studied in conjunction with other subjects, and that subjects should always be aware of the political dimension. He was schooled in the classics. He was a polymath, a generalist in the best possible sense, and he had the capacity to trespass across traditional disciplinary and professional boundaries. And he promoted a culture of risk-taking and excitement, as I'm going to suggest in the first part of my lecture, that to some extent I think we've lost today. The job of political science is to talk in an orderly manner, paying regard to consistency and verifiability, about a unique situation which is extremely complex and changed rapidly. That's what he wrote in his book, Politics and the Social Science, his best-selling Penguin. He didn't believe that lectures or even articles should be too worked out. And I'm just emphasising that about tonight's lecture, okay? Caveat number 2. That's put me off again. Yeah, they should stimulate, they should suggest things. They should leave students or readers to work things out for themselves. And it was really interesting. I couldn't help but reflect on how times have changed. When I read Dennis Kavanagh's, a professor at the University of Liverpool for a long time, he wrote an obituary for Bill Mackenzie. And Dennis wrote, a young colleague commented to me that a number of students did not fully understand Bill Mackenzie's lectures, but they did not doubt that they were listening to a great man. And I thought those were the days. Imagine trying to get away with that in today's context with the teaching excellence framework and straplines and... Oh. His intellectual talent rested on being able to see connections and to synthesize research that would otherwise have remained disconnected, and to suggest new areas for research. And in many ways, I'm suggesting that the overlap between emotions, feelings, anti-politics is exactly that new area for research. He suggests new ways of looking at the familiar. The new way for me tonight is through a prism that emphasizes the role of feelings and emotions. The familiar is the debate concerning the crisis of democracy and the changing nature of citizenship. Now, the second reason I want to focus on this topic is more prosaic but no less important. It's because I'm currently a special advisor to a House of Lords Select Committee. I feel safe. What's been really interesting, we've had over 250 submissions of evidence. We've had over 50 witnesses from all over the world come and give evidence about the contemporary citizenship challenge. I've taken the committee on a number of trips, but I can't help but feel still that actually we're not getting at the root of the issue, almost at the structure of a parliamentary inquiry is itself too rigid and too formal to really get to the heart of the issue. And then I had a glimpse, I had a moment. We had a trip to Sheffield, and we had a number of young people came in to meet members of the House of Lords, and I should pay my respects that 2 members of the Lords Committee is Baroness Blunkett of Brightside in Hillsborough in the city of Sheffield, David Blunkett, and also Ruth Lister, Baroness Lister of Bertiset, who has written widely on citizenship. But this young girl came along with a group of friends to talk about citizenship and her life. And she said, but she wouldn't say this publicly. She said it to me over a cup of tea in a corner of a room. She said, to be honest, citizenship doesn't mean anything to me. It just felt to her too formal, too dated, too legalistic, too old-fashioned. She said to me, if you want to understand citizenship, what matters to me is belonging. Do I feel like I belong? And as she said that, a penny dropped about the emotional roots of citizenship and why that matters. So I'm hoping that from tonight's discussion and the lecture, I might have something even to take back and to feed into that committee inquiry. And then, of course, I wanted to push myself and test myself. So, let me talk about imagination and anchorage. Now, I have got 3 hours tonight to talk for, haven't I? 3 hours? Is that 4? 5? God, no. So, I'm going to talk about imagination and anchorage. And when it comes to thinking about creativity and ambition, imagination and the social sciences, it's difficult not to reach for, not for that, for the work of this man. Who is this? Sorry? No. This is me travelling today from Sheffield getting to Glasgow. No, it's not. This is C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills, Passion. Gosh, his book. Brilliant. You know, if you want to understand the role and the capacity and the potential of the social sciences, this is your book. This is it, okay? And this is what I think we've lost or we're losing. Mills was a radical figure, both in relation to the nature of his research and his critique of what he saw as the drift. What was interesting about C. Wright Mills, and this is what I want to try and get across today, C. Wright Mills was critical about the changing nature of American society. He was also critical, quite separately, about the changing nature of professional social science and how it was undertaken. He didn't like the drift, because for him the drift was about disconnecting emotion, feeling, passion and connection with the public from the study of that public that should in reality be two sides of the same coin. So he focused on what was called the promise and the trap. Nowadays, men often feel that their private lives are a series of traps, Mills noted. In the opening line of this book, they sense that within their everyday worlds, they cannot overcome their troubles. And in this feeling, they are often quite correct. In what period have so many men been so totally exposed at so fast a pace to such an earthquake of change? What Mills labelled the trap was therefore the risk that social change was outpacing the public's capacity to make sense of the world around it. They felt trapped. Their normal frames of reference had gone or were going, were eroding, were melting. The promise, by contrast, related to the capacity of the social sciences to promote, crick, the public understanding of politics and society. The promise of the social sciences was that it could provide the information, the frames of reference, the ways of understanding a changing world through which members of the public, ordinary people, could make sense of the world and therefore have some control over it. That was the promise. The book, the man floating away, set adrift from society. But this would only happen if academics could demonstrate the sociological imagination. It could have been called anything. He said it could have been called the sociological imagination, the political imagination, the anthropological imagination. The title mattered less than the idea. And the idea was the need that academics have to be able to pivot, to turn. They need to be able to move from one perspective to another, from one discipline to another, from one topic to another, and to range from the most impersonal and remote transformations to the most intimate features of human life, and see the relations between the two. Most of all, the central element of the sociological imagination revolved around being able to see the relationship between the personal troubles and public issues. I'll just pause for a quick sip of water there. So, Mills was a large, brusque, Texan cowboy. He believed in taking it big, the title of his memoirs. And he believed that social scientists had a professional responsibility to the public. The sociological imagination is less a theory and more of a quality of mind that understands the interplay of the individual and society. I'd suggest that Bill Mackenzie had that imagination, that quality of mind, that capacity to pivot and shift, to range and dive across and between traditions, disciplines, and perspectives. But in highlighting Mill's sociological imagination, my aim is simply to highlight how this work revolved an awareness of emotional change and a critique of academic life. The trap that Mills placed at the centre of his analysis revolved around an explicit focus on feelings and emotions in a period of rapid change. The very shaping of history now outpaces the ability of men to orientate themselves in accordance with their cherished values. And which values? Even when men do not panic, men often sense that their older ways of feeling and thinking have collapsed, and that the new beginnings are ambiguous to the point of stasis. To read Mills was therefore to come away with a sense of how large sections of the American working class felt the misery of vague uneasiness. And it's quite easy to jump from that to today and think about contemporary American politics the Tea Party, to the debate in this country about the left behind. To be trapped was therefore to feel confused, fearful, anxious, adrift. But Mills was also keen to highlight this dimension of modern scholarship that could also be interpreted as a trap. And it is a trap I have before and will in the future organise. Too many academics have slipped into a trap. That is a trap around hyper-specialisation, theoretical fetishism, and an obsession with methodology at the expense of what you're actually looking at. That in many ways the professionalisation that has dominated much social science in the intervening decades has taken us along a road to not complete, but a road to increasing irrelevance that is more and more a topic of heated debate. You might argue that at a time when society most needed scholars with the sociological imagination, people like John Curtis with the ability to drift and reach, to talk across and between professional and different forms of life, that the social and political sciences actually became less able to fulfill this social demand at the point at which it was most needed. Moreover, many practitioners of the social sciences were themselves reluctant to take up the challenges posed by the complexity of modern life. Many, in fact, abdicate the intellectual and political task of the social analysis, Mills argued. Others, no doubt, are simply not up to the role for which they are nevertheless tasked. It was a stunning critique. It was, to be fair, Mills died, I'm 46, Mills died at 46. He wrote The Sociological Imagination. The wider academic profession never forgave him. He was an outcast, but to some extent he relished that outsider, Texan, cowboy mentality. I'm not saying we should all become like C. Wright Mills, but that notion of the imagination, the flair, the passion, the excitement, the joining up, the reading across, has been almost, I think, squeezed out of too much academic life. I've gone off record now, I've gone off my script. I don't know where I am. No, I'm okay. So, for this reason, we could from here go to Bernard Crick, was a great fan of C. Wright Mills. Bernard Crick wrote his PhD on the American science of politics, which was in itself very much within these arguments. And there's a whole outpouring of work that has recently made these arguments. But what I'm really trying to underline is that Mill's emphasis on the imagination attempted to highlight the need to understand emotions and feelings, and how modern life was increasingly alienating larger and larger sections of the public, and this was having an impact on their behaviour, on their attitudes to politics. The promise of the social sciences was that it could potentially reconnect the disaffected with the public sphere. Which leads me on to my second point, away from the imagination to this notion of anchorage. And in many ways, I would argue that although unwritten, the concept of anchorage anchored much of Mill's work, and particularly the sociological imagination. But it brings me to shift from Mills to, this is a book I put in late. This is, if you want to read the most damning critique of contemporary social science, this is the book. It's very interesting. I was talking to some PhD students and postdocs today, did a little session, it was fantastic. But I was actually talking about how, as a social scientist who now spends an increasing amount of time in Westminster and Whitehall, arguing in favour of more social scientific funding, it can actually be very tricky when many of my own leading social scientists, although I agree completely with the arguments they're making, are publishing books all about the irrelevance of the social and political sciences. This is the man an old great friend, sadly passed away fairly recently, who I think takes us beyond Mills and into this focus on anchorage. Anybody want to have a go at my Name the Man game? Sorry? Good. This is Zygmunt Bauman. Zygmunt was a small, frail, quietly spoken man. The only thing he shared with Mills was their intellectual overlap and a love of smoking pipes. You couldn't think about two more different people. If we've got time later, I'll tell you my Bauman story, but I don't want to use up the lecture. Bauman's very interested. Like Crick, he understood why politics mattered, because twice in Bauman's life, he'd had to flee with everything he owned and his children and wife in a car from fear of death. Once in the Second World War, and then after the Second World War, when the communists in Poland wanted to kill him. He had to pack up overnight, put everything in his car, and flee Poland, and for years he travelled like a nomad around the world, from academic to academic position, trying to find a permanent role. Unfortunately, when he did, it was in Leeds, but I can say that because I'm from Sheffield, and we do that with Leeds. So the University of Leeds now has a very good Bauman Institute. But what Bauman offered was this focus on liquid modernity and liquidity. It provided a focus on the loss of anchorage amongst increasingly large publics. And at the focus of this liquidity argument was the rupturing of traditional social bonds. But also there was an awareness of the emotional dimensions. And this is reflected in his books. Liquid love, liquid fear, liquid evil. He was aware, anchorage, liquidity, emotions. It was almost a triangle that defined all of Zygmunt's work. Now, what does this focus on liquidity actually mean? Put simply, it relates to a change within society and how change is occurring more and more rapidly in the late modern world. In many ways, what seems to be eroding are those traditional social relationships that Mills himself focused on when he said about people feeling trapped. Different types of change across each and every dimension of modern life: work, relationships, communities, religion, even warfare. Even elements of life that once, until fairly recently, appeared relatively simple and straightforward, such as gender definition. Everything has suddenly become more complex and more fluid. But what unites them all is precisely their fragility, their temporariness, their vulnerability, and their inclination to constant change. To be modern means to modernize, compulsively, obsessively, not so much just to be, let alone to keep its identity intact, but forever becoming, avoiding completion, staying underdefined. Each new structure replaces the previous, on and on and on, and as soon as it is declared old-fashioned and past its used-by date, everything is just a momentary settlement until further notice. Anybody who's worked in a British university in recent years, there are now research projects on liquid academics, liquid scholarship. I joke you not. But if you think about how fast-paced things are changing, the ref, the TEF, the KEF. But there are just 2 points I want to take from Bauman's work. One political, one academic. The political is something that we'll look at later on, but revolves around how political structures, political parties, bureaucracies, etc., that were born and designed in much simpler, more solid times, must somehow now adapt to cope with fluidity. But they too often appear like dinosaurs, wandering aimlessly across the political savannah, like sleepwalkers who don't really understand where they're going or why. In fact, the leaner, the meaner, the faster, the more flexible parties do tend to be those more aggressive, populist, insurgent parties. But there's an underlying argument about the role of scholars and scholarship here, and a critique about the lack of emotional intelligence that goes back to a certain brand of professionalism. And I think this goes back to Crick, to Mackenzie, Mills. There's a theme. Bauman's sociology is above all a sociology of imagination, of feelings, of human relations, love, fear, despair, indifference, insecurity, insensitivity, and of intimate lived experience. Bauman was an admitted methodological eclectic. Empathy and sensitivity were much more important to him than methodological or theoretical purity. I once actually, I hold a little record in a very small political science world for having the largest ever Twitter spike given in a politics lecture. And this happened by accident when I said I was getting a bit emotional and I complained about obsessions and what I termed methodological masturbation. And when I came off the stage and went behind the screen, somebody said, "What did you do out there?" And they'd been following the Twitter. And when I'd said this sort of methodological masturbation, everybody seemed to just go, boom, and it's my only small, I swore never to say it again, so I've blown that one, but it's my own small claim to fame. So, wouldn't this be possible to pivot, Mills-like, into a discussion of the work of, for example, Michael Burrowoy on public sociology, or the discussion concerning the growth of the precariat, those who exist in an economic hinterland of short-term in and out of work. One of the great challenges for higher education, for learned societies, is that the academic precariat is growing massively. Those with PhDs who are trying to find their first permanent positions but are existing on one after another, rolling 1-2-year contracts, teaching positions, the precariat. The precariat is interesting because it's increasing in size, moving up the social ladder to take over occupations that were once safe, permanent, middle-class occupations. We don't have time to look at that. We might have looked at Danny Dorling's work on equality and his arguments about the equality effect. But all I want to do here is focus on the work of Mills and Bauman and to suggest that their focus on imagination in terms of intellectual empathy and anchorage in terms of emotional impact of social change provides real leverage in understanding what I'm trying to get at, which is why feelings trump facts, or why they can sometimes trump facts, and what are the implications of that for academics trying to communicate with people that have feelings that we need to understand in a more empathetic way. Put very simply, if you live in a pit village without a pit, a fishing port without fish, a steel city without steel, a railway town without a railway, a seaside resort without tourists, or a shipbuilding city without many ships to build, then how you feel, as defined by your lived everyday experience, or what Grayson said, the world as you see it from your window, from your favourite pub or your cafe, that is your emotional truth, no matter what the experts say. Which leads me on to my second part of tonight's lecture, and a focus on hope and sacrifice. Let's take a quick break. Is this generally okay? People see no one's got up and walked out so far. Is this generally okay? You're very polite. Thank you very much. Good, good, good. So the previous section strode across a lot of analytical terrain. It argued that the concepts of imagination and anchorage, drawing from the work of Mills and Bauman, offered a double benefit. They highlighted the role of emotions and feelings, while they also offered a critique of the social and political sciences for drifting away from a deeper social connection. In relation to politics and emotions, I would generally argue that despite the existence of the affective term within the social sciences in general, and particularly within citizenship studies, the study of why and how feelings about politics matter remains underdeveloped. Hence, my lecture this evening. Now, I'm not for 1 minute arguing that this is an area that has been completely overlooked in the existing research base. But I am suggesting that the link between emotions and politics, or more specifically, why feelings matter, has not been thoroughly interrogated when it comes to understanding the rise of political disaffection. Fortunately, this is an argument that has recently been made with great precision, insight, and dare I say a little imagination, by a young scholar called Laura Jenkins. And my aim here in this section is really just to repeat her own arguments. The first point is that it would be wrong to say that the existing literature on disaffected Democrats has no emotional foundation. It does. It generally charts a rather barren political landscape, defined by feelings of distrust and contempt for politicians, political institutions, and political processes. Negative, pessimistic, cynical feelings seem to define the modern condition. But what tends to be missing is analyses that get beneath the skin of why these feelings are actually so endemic. And that's what I'm trying to get at this evening. And to be honest, I'm doing it with you. I'm not telling you anything. I'm thinking and learning and as I talk with you. I don't want you to think that I have any answers to complex questions. But I really feel that there's something about not getting beneath the emotional skin of what is happening out there. Put slightly differently, survey research is usually the primary methodology, with case studies, focus groups, and interviews sometimes deployed to add qualitative tone, texture, and depth. But what are too often missing, unless I've just missed them and they do exist, and people might tell me in discussion, are those deep, immersive, observational analyses that place the scholar at the heart of the disengaged communities. Those communities they seek to really understand. Nearly 3 decades after Richard Fenno commented that not enough political scientists are engaged in observation, little, I would suggest, has changed. A recent review came to the conclusion that political science has yet to embrace ethnography, and particularly participant observation wholeheartedly. There is, it's been suggested, a double absence of politics in ethnography and of ethnography in politics. Now, I don't know enough about ethnography to judge that discipline, but I would argue that within political science, there is a real lack of ethnography, which is why I'm very pleased that Rod Rhodes, University of Southampton, has now created a centre for political ethnography, and I'll be happy to support that as much as I can. But if the existing research base highlights a problem, what's interesting from this literature is that it also suggests a solution. And this is where Laura Jenkins has been very, very critical of me and my work. And that's absolutely fine, because that's what scholarship is about. And she does it in an incredibly polite, constructive way. But a lot of this literature argues that the solution to political disaffection lies in increasing the public understanding of politics through civics and citizenship education in a way that allows you to reduce the public's expectations about what politics can realistically deliver. Something that I have definitely argued and written about. So, for example, Jerry Stoker, building on Crick's classic In Defence of Politics, argue, many citizens fail to appreciate that politics is, in the end, it involves the collective imposition of decisions, demands, and it demands a complex communication process and generally works through messy compromise. Politics is designed to disappoint. The argument being that if the public understood politics a little better, they might be less disappointed. And that is an argument that I have made, and I think to some extent was not wrong or right. But this young scholar has really made me think, because what she argues is that actually the danger with that, I'm getting bold, the danger with that solution is that if our response to political disaffection and alienation revolves around lowering the public's expectations, then we risk destroying the essence of politics, the hope, the belief, the joy that can really animate positive behaviour. In many ways, we risk squashing the political imagination out of existence. Lowering expectations may lead to states of pessimism, and that strong emotional inspiration for political action, yes, we can, could be lost if we say, no, you can't. I put that bit in myself there. I've gone ad-libbing now, you see. So we're going to go wrong in a minute. So, moreover, seeking to lower expectations, I've never met this Laura Jenkins, but she's very good. Laura Jenkins suggests is a somewhat unemotional, rationalised solution to a public emotional problem. Without the bold imagination, hopeful rhetoric, raw emotions, high expectations, and passionate struggles by prominent campaigners facing significant risks, is it likely that the suffrage would ever have been extended, slavery abolished, national independence achieved for colonised states, apartheid defeated in South Africa, and so on? We need to have hope in politics. We need to promote the public's expectations, not to deflate them. So for her, the cultivation of hope is not some sort of dreamy, wishy-washy, romantic aspiration, but it is in itself a self-soothing and sustaining critical element of contemporary political practice. Practicing hope invites us, she says, to shed emotions, to lose fear and despair. This in turn, and from a rather oblique angle, brings me back to my original plan to talk about the civic journey and the work I've been doing in the House of Lords. The committee and many other participants in the debate are concerned with promoting citizenship and embedding civic values in ways that promote social integration. This might look at citizenship education in schools, faith schools, National Citizenship Service. But what Jenkins asks is whether we need to be more creative. Do we need to spend more time cultivating positive emotions in the manner that Martha Nussbaumer suggested through her focus on love, sympathy, and compassion? To some extent, I think that was what 20 years ago Bernard Crick was trying to do. Bernard Crick had an incredibly imaginative, ambitious plan for citizenship education in schools. If you go back to the original Crick report, published 20 years ago this year, Crick talks about changing the fundamental culture of democratic politics. Crick understood why emotions mattered and why positive emotions, positive feelings could be inculcated within society through activities and education that everybody was involved in, that wasn't about profit or markets, and that emphasised collective we, not I. The problem was that the civic Crickian vision of citizenship education was never implemented. It was hollowed out at birth, poorly implemented, and in more recent years eviscerated by a focus on character education and the promotion of the individual. But there's something about, I can understand this idea about emotions, feeling passion, and our need not to lower expectations and to try and promote hope and belief. But there's a little worry in my head that these good intentions could come crashing down upon the Procrustean realities of contemporary politics if we fail to acknowledge the existence of embedded barriers. And it's this focus on barriers, walls and obstacles that leads me to pivot again from hope to sacrifice. And the way I do that is through Mishra's wonderful book, The Age of Anger, because it reveals not only how history tends to rhyme, but also how the contemporary condition is driven by the manner in which social, political, and technological shifts have cast many millions of people adrift, uprooted from tradition in a manner that resonates with the arguments of Mills and Bauman regarding the trap and liquidity.
The promise of freedom, stability, and prosperity is delivered to a chosen few, but not the masses. The ranks of the disaffected understandably feel angry, disillusioned, and left behind, susceptible to demagogues and populists. Those who seem to have sacrificed the most in terms of their anchorage, their stability, and taken the risks, seem to have gained the least from an increasingly precarious, upside-down world. And if you're at the wrong end of that world, if you're looking up and not looking down, it's no good being told that the facts suggest that materially you've never been so wealthy or life has never been so good. The feelings are still true. Feelings trump facts. And if you don't understand why feelings can trump facts, you end up with Trump. So, if you want to really understand then this issue of emotions, how can so many people get it so wrong? But actually even that question, how can so many people get it wrong? That in itself reveals more about my lack of emotional intelligence, my emotional illiteracy, and the need for me to try and understand emotional truths. One way of doing this is to look at those rare studies that have generally, beyond political science and beyond the UK, begun to generate a fuller understanding of the link between emotion and politics through thick, immersive field research. This is a relatively new kind of political literature inspired by Thomas Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas, and would include a number of texts that which in themselves can be traced back to classic ethnographic works such as Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa and Clifford Geertz's Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. But amongst this body of work, I'd say there was one piece that really allows us to understand emotions and feelings and why feelings may well trump facts. It's arguably the most insightful account. It's interesting. Hochschild is a left-leaning, grey-haired, mild-mannered sociologist from California. She is a big fan of C. Wright Mills. She travels to southwestern Louisiana to observe the Tea Party in the geographical core of misery and anti-establishment hellfire rage. Hochschild's aim was to develop exactly that emotional literacy, to expose those emotional truths that Grace and Perry had encouraged scholars to grasp in the UK in the wake of the Brexit referendum. It's funny, in preparation for her journey down south, she reads the classic work of Ayn Rand, works like The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. But on her journey, she fails to encounter a single person who shows the slightest interest in literature. And yet in the local bookshop, there are 3 aisles reserved for Bibles. And yet the critical element that I want to take from Hochschild's work in order to develop our focus on feelings, and particularly Jenkins' focus on how a more hopeful, positive set of feelings could be cultivated, is an awareness of what Hochschild calls the empathy wall and the paradox and the deep story. Because it's this deep story which I argue takes us to the heart of emotional understanding. So the empathy wall separates political groups, preventing deep understanding of the other side. Is it possible, she asks, without changing our beliefs, to know others from the inside, to see reality through their eyes, to understand the links between life, feeling, politics? That is, to cross the empathy wall. I thought that it was. But while Hochschild tries to tear down her empathy wall, the Tea Partiers only speak about building their own wall on the Mexican border. And yet at the same time, there appears a major paradox, and this is where I think there are interesting links to the UK. This is a paradox around the mismatch between the evidence and the facts and the feelings. It's a paradox around the white working class in southwest Louisiana and how they feel about what's in their best interests. Hochschild says, across the country, red Republican states are poorer. They have more teen mothers, more divorce, worse health, more obesity, more trauma-related deaths, more low birth weight babies and lower school enrollment. On average, people in red states die 5 years earlier than people in blue. Indeed, the gap in life expectancy between Louisiana and Connecticut, in Louisiana it's 75 years old, in Connecticut it's over 80, that gap is the same as between the United States and Nicaragua. The poorer and more conservative you are, the worse off you're likely to be, and the sooner you're going to die. This holds even on the county level. Yet the very people most damaged by the conservative policies in the United States are most likely to vote for them. In recent years, comparative studies on the rise of the right-wing populist nationalism have generally offered two explanations for why this would happen. The first is the economic inequality perspective, which highlights overwhelming evidence of powerful trends towards greater income and wealth inequality in the West, an increasingly precarious economic existence, and concern about inflows of migrants and refugees. If you're older, less educated, or live beyond thriving cities, then securing well-paid or long-term employment is increasingly difficult. If you feel you have little to lose, why not take a chance on those that seem to offer simple solutions to complex challenges? This argument flows into a second and related explanation, the cultural backlash theory. This sees cultural change as key. Public support for progressive values, such as cosmopolitanism, feminism, environmentalism, were to some extent based on the security delivered through post-war economic growth. In a period of economic austerity, the cultural escalator appears to have stopped or even gone into reverse. The silent revolution of the 1970s, Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris conclude, appears to have spawned an angry and resentful counter-revolutionary backlash today. The backlash theory would resonate with Jonathan Haidt's argument in The Righteous Mind that Tea Party voters, they're not misled or stupid. They just care more deeply about cultural issues than they do about economic principles. But back to the Bayou and Hochschild in Louisiana, and her view that both of these theories, the economic and the cultural, were missing something. She said, I found one thing missing in them all, a full understanding of emotion in politics. What I wanted to know is, what did people want to feel? Think they should feel or couldn't feel? And what do they feel about a range of issues? How then do deep Tea Party voters feel? Well, they're angry, they're bitter, they're resentful, that much is obvious. But Hochschild goes further, and this is her great contribution. She develops for them what in brand marketing would be called the backstory, or what she prefers to call the deep story. And this is where we get to the nub. The deep story that Hochschild creates for the Tea Party is a parable of the white American dream. It begins with an image of a long line of people marching across a vast landscape, the Tea Partiers. They're white, older, Christian, predominantly male, many lacking college degrees. The Tea Partiers are somewhere in the middle of this great line. They trudge on wearily but with resolve, up a hill. And ahead, beyond the ridge of the hill, lies wealth, success, and dignity. Far beyond them, the Tea Partiers, behind them in the line, there are people of colour, women, immigrants, refugees. As pensions are reduced and layoffs happen, as the economy shrinks, the line starts to slow down in terms of moving forward. Then it stops. This is the deep story. An even greater indignity then follows. People begin jumping the queue in front of the white working class Americans. Many of those who had long stood behind them, blacks, women, immigrants, refugees, are allowed to cut in, aided by the federal government. Next, an even more astonishing figure jumps ahead of them. A brown pelican, Hochschild writes. The Louisiana state bird, fluttering its long and oil-drenched wings. Thanks to environmental protection, it is granted higher social status than, say, an oil rig worker. The pelican, writes Hochschild, needs clean fish to eat, clean water to dive in, oil-free marshes, and protection from coastal erosion. That's why it's in line ahead of you. But really, it's just an animal and you're a human being. Meanwhile, the Tea Partiers are made to feel less than human. They find themselves reviled for their Christian morality, their traditional values, that they've been taught to honour from birth. Many of them speak of sympathy fatigue, the sense that every demographic group but theirs receives sympathy. People think we're not good enough, one of the people says to Hochschild. They think we're not good enough if we don't feel sorry for black people or immigrants or the Syrian refugees. But I am a good person, and I don't feel sorry for them. What Hochschild is explaining here is that people with whom she has little in common and whose political outlook she objects to completely have logical, rational reasons for engaging in the way they do. Her version of the story is simple. As far as the Tea Party members are concerned, you're a stranger in your own land. You don't recognise yourself in how others see you. It's a struggle to feel seen and be honoured. And to feel honoured, you have to feel and be seen as moving forward. But through no fault of your own and in ways that are hidden, you're slipping backward. Hochschild reveals the emotional soul of those that feel left behind, who yearn for a sense of belonging, for anchorage and acceptance, who feel strangers, not citizens, in their own land. That's why feelings matter, because they provide a foundation for a worldview that can prove incredibly resilient to arguments based on facts, science, and expert opinion. So the critical element, in many ways, for this lecture is to emphasise that when viewed in the context of these people's everyday lives, the politics that Trump and the Tea Party have come... The politics of Trump and the Tea Party has come to make rational sense. It's an emotional truth. What drives people on these topics, like immigration or the environment, healthcare, is unlikely to be a rational weighing up of the evidence, but how a particular argument or view of the world connects with a people's sense of themselves, where they're heading, and their way of life. Feelings trump facts, and at play here are specific feeling rules. The right of the political spectrum seeks release, freedom from post-war liberal notions of what they should feel. They don't want to have to feel happy for gay newlyweds. They don't want to have to feel sad at the plight of refugees. They don't want to feel worried about the environment. The left, however, dismiss the rejection of those feelings as prejudice and intolerance that in itself arguably displays a lack of empathy and understanding. And I would say that bizarrely, it is often those on the left that seem most unable to scale the empathy wall, which allows me to finish, you'll be glad to know, with a very quick conclusion, which will bring us to a bus and a tree. The aim of this lecture has been to explore the relationship between anti-politics, citizenship, and emotions. And I've tried to do that by a focus on feelings and the imagination and anchorage, and particularly Hochschild's work on empathy walls and feeling rules. I began by noting my role in the House of Lords on citizenship and civic participation, and a curious sense that we were missing something and that the role of emotions needed to be foregrounded. And in this regard, I think the concept of deep stories provides a valuable lens into understanding contemporary social discontent in the UK as well as the US. So let me return to this focus on Mills, to move from the macro to the micro and to ground this analysis back in the UK and bring it down to a very basic level. What's interesting about this focus on emotions is that it adds a new dimension to contemporary debates in the wake of the 2017 general election about the emergence of two tribes. By this I mean, and John Curtis knows far more about this than I do, is the emergence in British politics of a new schism. A schism in which now your education and where you live and your age plays an increasingly important role. What I think's really interesting about this new schism is that it emphasizes the role of emotions. We have here two different tribes that arguably have very different feeling rules. They have a very different backstory. They want very different things. And the challenge for politicians is how to deliver the bandwidth that can unite both of these two tribes. Now, the issue about emotions and why they matter in sensitivity, and my argument about this is a particular issue for the left, I can hit on the head very simply with this. This is it. Emily Thornberry's photo-linked tweet during the Rochester and... Do you say Stroud or Stroud? Stroud? Stroud and Stroud? Rochester and Stroud? By-election in 2014 caused a controversy because to many working class communities it epitomised a broader feeling that the Labour Party had become a cosmopolitan elite that no longer understood and even mocked and patronised traditional working class values, pride, patriotism, St George's flag. With the benefit of hindsight, what was particularly noteworthy about the Leave campaign was the manner in which, in a relatively simplistic and emotionally charged statements, could forge such a powerful connection with such large sections of the public. Why? Because the Leave campaign was able to connect with long-standing British cultural, emotional idiosyncrasies, particularly in relation to immigration. Put slightly differently, the Leave campaign managed to tap into a deep story that many people still believe in. Nostalgia was once defined as an illness, has now become a chronically underestimated political force. As Alan Finlayson has written, Brexit became a campaign of anti-political politics organised around resentment at past losses and scepticism about promised futures. The sense of a loss of tradition, a mythical integrity, an eviscerated global status, a romanticised past, plus nationalist anxiety were all set against the perceived excesses of a distant, powerful elite. Now, you might think I'm down here over-egging my pudding. But think for a minute. Think about the most successful recent films. Dunkirk, The Darkest Hour. Think about the success of The Crown on Netflix. The popularity of Poldark and Downton Abbey. Think about our children and horrible histories. Yet the role of nostalgia as an emotional safety blanket is largely dismissed by many mainstream parties on the left, while populists flick emotive triggers that play to the deep story of a glorious immigrant-free past that in reality never existed. Take, for example, the hometown of my father. I said I was from Swindon, and I did not lie. My father came from Doncaster, a railway town, and he moved to Swindon, another railway town. Doncaster has had to cope with deindustrialisation. People have had to find new meaning to changes affecting their lives. In the space left by the dissolution of industrialism, communities nostalgically invoked the industrial past to cope with existential insecurity. Some called upon the lost empire, others turned to exclusionary Englishness as the solution to their hardship. In 2015, UKIP strategically located their annual conference in the white majority working class town of Doncaster. And how did they do it? They tapped into emotions and feelings. They promised a secure and prosperous future for British nationals in the extractive industries. Does that remind anybody of anybody in the United States recently? The UKIP code was carefully designed to tap into an underlying deep story, in this case coal nationalism, and the feelings of stability and belonging that the industrial heritage of the town invoked. Feeling nostalgia was therefore a powerful emotion and a meaning-making resource for the public. Now, I'm quite nostalgic myself. I can remember spending my summer holidays when my friends jetted off to package holidays in Spain and Italy and France. I got to go to Doncaster and in the late 1980s, and I would go fishing at Cosworth Hall, and I would travel around on the brown and cream buses because they were heavily subsidised as part of the Social Republic of South Yorkshire. 2p was the maximum fare. And yet even here I can make a link between my rosy memories and Hochschild's work in America. I can make the leap between South America and South Yorkshire very simply. The Tea Party Code was carefully designed to tap into the American dream. It was a shrill performance of emotionalism that is in itself very different to the empathy and emotional intelligence that Grayson Perry promoted. Hochschild, if you remember, tells us that the life inequalities remain rife from state to state, with people in red states dying on average 5 years earlier than people in blue states. But in Sheffield, we've got a bus. You won't be surprised to know. We've got a lot of buses, but we have one bus called the 83 bus. The 83 bus begins in the north of the city, travels south to the old industrial belt around Firvale and Burngreave, and ends up, you can take a choice here, to finish in the leafy suburbs of either Fulwood or Bents Green. If you live at the beginning of the route, you are likely to die a decade younger than those who live at the end of our bus. The bus does tell a tale of two cities, two tribes, one rich, one poor, the anywheres, the nowheres. Different deep stories, but all feeling angry about politics for different reasons. But similar bus routes that track inequality, they can be found all over the country, especially in Glasgow, where socio-economic inequalities have long been part of its relatively poor life expectancy figures. The life expectancy today for the average man in Parkhead and Dalmarnock is not miles better. It's miles worse than most of the rest of the country. It's just 68. Many people feel strangers in their own land. So that's it. That brings me to the end. And my story about a tree and its focus on feelings and fellings, roots, walls, they'll have to wait. But I can't help remember that in his long essay about the life of Bill Mackenzie, Richard Rose notes that Bill he closed his own memoirs with a poem from T.S. Eliot, Little Gidding, the fourth and final poem of Eliot's 4 quartets. It said, "To arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." And we have tonight, this evening, in this lecture, we've come full circle back to where we started, with a focus on the need to better understand why feelings matter. As Newbaum argues, we're not automatons, we're not robots who will be persuaded by the most rational political arguments and principles. We are enthused, touched, affected, moved by things to which we establish significance. Thus, we need to care about our visions and our goals. The question I want to leave you with is, where are those with the capacity to scale the empathy wall? Where are the politicians who can understand the concerns of those they may not agree with, who can transcend competing narratives of victimhood, anger, rage, and blame, and who, most of all, understand the difference between being popular rather than populist. But in the honour of Professor Mackenzie, I too would like to end, not with a question, but with a short poem that revolves around emotions and feelings, roots and anchorage, hope and imagination, and why these things matter. And it is, I must admit, my poem about a tree. Joyce Kilmer's. I think that I shall never see a poem lovelier than a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the sweet earth's flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, and who intimately lives with rain. Poems and lectures are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. That's it.
Thank you very much, Matt, for what we all knew was going to be a very engaging lecture. Yes, I think you probably deserve to sit down for a couple of minutes. Could I just first of all say, if anybody does need to leave, don't feel embarrassed. We are running a bit over time, but I do still propose to have 5 or 10 minutes for questions before we go off for a drink. If you want to ask a question, just catch my eye. I'm going to use the chairman's privilege first, because although, Matt, you did your best to be nice to the chair, I'm afraid it won't necessarily be reciprocated. You seem to be suggesting in most of what you were saying that emotion was, as it were, almost the politics of the right or the politics of the social conservative, and perhaps that almost that emotion was exclusively the politics of the right of the social conservative. But I mean, is it not true that, for example, somebody who wishes to defend the multicultural nature of the diverse city like London, as many of those on the Remain side in the city did, are they not also promoting something in which they feel a strong sense of emotional investment? Aren't many of those who will call themselves feminists, trying to advocate the position of women, also promoting something in which they feel a great deal of emotional investment, as indeed did the suffragette movement that we've just been remembering? Aren't those who've been advocating the rights of those in same-sex relationships been also engaged in the politics of emotion? And aren't you perhaps at risk, therefore, of setting up the classic liberal academic elite competition between supposedly the facts, which indeed, of course, those who are on the left or are liberal supposedly have, and emotion as being that of the right? Shouldn't we just be honest to say that actually both sides in these arguments, whether they're about social class, whether they're about liberalism, conservatism, are both sides are trading in emotion as well as in facts?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. I'm not trying to argue one side or another. What I'm arguing, I think, and the issue is that you're absolutely right. The two tribes, the two sides of Brexit, they all have their emotional roots and bases. But I think the issue is, at the moment, that we seem almost in a point of gridlock, where, using Hochschild's notion of the empathy wall, it's almost as if nobody is able to scale, tear down, or accept the valid emotions of both sides. In many ways, I think the problem is that there's too much noise and not enough listening going on.
Well, certainly it's true that, I mean, perhaps one of the reasons for why we are where we are is, of course, that it happens to be the case that most academics are indeed relatively socially liberal, and in truth they are in fact therefore players in this game. They do have a sociological imagination. It's just, however, a sociological imagination of the kind of vision that they wish to create, and it isn't one that necessarily others. But I mean, if there's a criticism, arguably, perhaps what is remarkable about perhaps the social science community at the moment is the failure to realize that perhaps it actually has a vested interest in some of the arguments that it is promoting, and that for somehow all of a sudden those who oppose them are engaged in false consciousness. But it seems to be an extraordinary blindness here that actually perhaps they are players in a political game rather than necessarily neutral experts who indeed have some facts that everybody should be acknowledging.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think on that Michael Ignatieff has got this very good book called Fire and Ashes, where he talks about the role of academics in society, and he makes a set of arguments about academics inevitably being political actors, and the need to, in many ways, bring that to the fore and acknowledge that. I think one of the interesting things about the role of social science in Brexit and the Leave or the Remain or whatever was that looking back, there was an issue around how those who wanted to remain for one reason or another were not able to frame their arguments or narrate those arguments in ways that could somehow dovetail with a deeper emotional backstory amongst the public. And I can understand why many academics don't want to soil their hands, get involved in the rough and tumble of politics. I can understand that completely.
Okay, there's a gentleman here in the front who wants it, and then there's a lady in the corner there who happens to be my wife. I better declare an interest. So we have the gentleman first, and then...
Hi, thanks for a really good talk and so many great elements in it, and I particularly like the reference to Pankaj Mishra's book, The Age of Anger. I wondered if another ingredient that might be useful in this would be Stuart Hall and the analysis of hegemony, and that, in a sense, that was a really important intervention for British political science to engage with in the 80s and subsequently, and perhaps part of the limitation of British political science has been not to take on board more that kind of perspective, which is the sort of commonplace in radical democratic politics kind of approaches, whether more Gramscian or a bit of Foucauldian.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with you completely. I think there are a whole number of different ways, and one of the sort of positive ways of sort of preparing tonight's lecture was that it strikes me as such a fruitful way of getting into a whole number of different arguments, and in many ways this nearly turned it into sort of 5 different lectures, or it was almost exploded. There were so many rich ways that you could go and you could take it, but I think in many ways what I'm always slightly surprised about, and I have this whole notion of the sort of Foucauldian, the hegemony, the governmentality, is that in many ways I think the higher education in the UK in recent years has almost evolved without there being a lot of actual protest by academics about the impact of increasingly managerialist reforms. In many ways, I think academics have been incredibly well-behaved, polite, and all the rest of it. But the point about Stuart Hall is one that I should take away and have a bit of reading on.
I hate to tell you, I don't think my head of school would say I was well-behaved, but anyway, Lisa.
Lisa Curtis. I was really struck by this idea of the loss of public duty and recapturing it for political science through imagination. I just wonder if there are some members of the intellectual liberal elite who haven't shrunk from that challenge, and what do you think would be the value of reconnecting with theatre, with arts, with the novels, who are, I'm thinking of Ali Smith or someone who absolutely are right on this.
Yeah, I think, the Crick Centre has a big research strand on art, politics and expression. So we've worked with theatre companies all over the world, and actually had research grants looking at the role of participatory theatre in re-engaging young people. I think there are obviously lots of academics out there who are fully engaged and are really committed. I think What's interesting, though, is a lot of the time the work of those scholars is not recognised to quite the same level that it should be. If you're not, I hate to say this, I don't know who I'm apologising to, I'm apologising to somebody, but there is a strong sense with the ref in the back of your mind that if you're not doing high data, quantified political science in big journals, that you're not really doing real research, and that the more inevitably messy, complex, but no less legitimate and important research isn't ranked. And you've had this, the whole methodological pyramid in America, you know. So for me, that is something that we really need to think more creatively about. I was talking to somebody earlier, when I started my career, you had to teach one night a week in the evening and one weekend a month. It just came with a job, and that was to teach people that were working full time. We used to have, that's all gone. The Institute of Lifelong Learning is generally gone, and you know, we need to somehow recreate, reinvigorate that sort of Crickian, Mackenzie, civic university in a more buoyant, vibrant manner.
Right, quite a few hands. Gentleman here, yep. And then there's a gentleman just behind as well.
So, a question. Would you say from what you read on this then that the Remain campaign didn't hit the deep story for their own demographic? And from what you were saying earlier, it sounded basically that the people who felt they were in traps further went into traps when you're addressing the belonging problem in other groups, which created more traps elsewhere and just was a cycle. So do you see any end to a cycle like that without going into high emotions? Or?
I mean, it's on the issue of the story. I think one of the interesting elements here, and this is an insight for, particularly I think for academics about how far they're willing to take their research, is that the Leave campaign was great. It was very emotive. Just keep banging out those very simple claims: take back power, strong borders, all this, you know, apple pie motherhood stuff. But the Leave campaign tried to win the argument largely through facts and information, but in many ways the facts and the information that they could give didn't offer a strong enough message or leverage, or wasn't presented in the everyday language that members of the public can understand. So going back to Grayson Perry and his argument that people made decisions about Brexit from sitting in their cafe and looking out of their window, when asked what does the European Union do for us, at a very basic everyday lived experience level, there weren't enough clear, simple answers for the people.
Okay. There's a gentleman, yeah, yep, sure.
In this wide-ranging, really interesting talk, there seems to be a kind of constant implication, kind of repeated motif of, I guess, the subject and the subjectivity of the subject, namely an engagement and interest in emotion, driving towards a particular methodology, something that's closer to ethnographic, that's closer to grounded, closer, you know, much more kind of textual.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for instance, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, whereby he has taken kind of psychometric approaches to understand differences in political aspirations and approaches, and the way perhaps the same facts are interpreted and different priorities are made. So what are some further reasons for suggesting that emotions are best approached through methodologies that allow greater direct exposure to them?
Okay, so what you've done there, very correctly, is you've identified my vulnerability. I've come into this field fairly recently, and I'm not even going to try and hide that. My sense, because I'm a political scientist, public policy, governance, legislative studies is my world, is that from my understanding of the current political science literature, We don't do feelings and emotion that much. But you might have helpfully identified pools of scholarship that would be good for me to engage with. The reason, there's a personal and a political reason here, and I'm going to be completely honest. The Crick Centre works with a whole range of, I was discussing earlier, how could you use the whole quants and how could you use sort of experimental psychology to look into feelings and emotions. I'm quite happy that all of that offers different perspectives, but I can't help but feeling if you really want to understand why feelings might trump facts, is you need to have a much closer, and the thing about trees is a project I couldn't talk about, is I've just spent the last year doing ethnographic field work around the felling of 5,500 of Sheffield's street trees. These are basically a public-private contract, a PFI. The private contractor has no interest in maintaining trees, chop them down. The public are in uproar. The council say we can't do anything, we're bound into a 25-year PFI contract. What's interesting there is there's an empathy wall. The councillors, Labour councillors, they don't understand why the public are getting so worked up around a few trees. They don't get it. And yet you spend time with the people they're spending 24 hours a day protecting trees. These trees for these people are actually symbolic of something far more than just the tree. It's about control of their local community and their environments. And I'll be perfectly honest, the other reason I'm interested in this is I've just created, if anyone wants to get involved, a new partnership with the British Psychological Association, where we have a joint research group now. The political study, political psychology, and the British Psychological Association are working together, and this project, which is looking at the mental well-being of politicians, no need to snigger, called Governing Under Pressure. And also, I'm going to be very honest, I've spent my life struggling with mental health problems. And I suppose what I'm interested in here is when I'm having a bad time, when I'm really having an episode, it doesn't matter what my wife says to me or people say to me, the feelings are true. And so for me, feelings matter, because sometimes my feelings dominate the facts that I really should believe in. And I think that's, for me, makes this slightly more edgy.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think probably at this point we probably do need to come close. That clearly is a good grace note on which to finish. Matt, thank you very much indeed for an extremely engaging lecture, and to be honest, an extremely honest lecture. And as you say, it is not always the case when academics tell you they're not quite sure of the veracity of what they're arguing. So thank you very much for that and being so open.